Please welcome the Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, Candace Montgomery.
Hello, everyone. As they said, I'm Candace Montgomery, Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, and we are delighted to have you join us for this timely conversation exploring being human, the stories and science behind our health. From the shifting national healthcare landscape to the science of sleep and breakthroughs in women's healthcare, we'll spotlight the expert insights to help us all live healthier lives. Before we dive in, I want to thank our underwriters, Eli Lilly and Company and Gilead Sciences, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism. Please silence your cell phones, but keep them handy. If something you see or hear today captures your attention, we encourage you to share it with your social network using hashtag TAF25. We hope you enjoy the session. Now let's begin.
Here to discuss the RFK Jr. revolution, please welcome Yasmin Tayag, staff writer at The Atlantic, Nicholas Florko, staff writer at The Atlantic, and Daniel Engber, senior editor at The Atlantic, with Andrea Valdez, managing editor at The Atlantic.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So there's so much news on this topic going on right now. So we just saw a CDC advisory panel yesterday, who knows what's going to happen today, recommend not giving the MMRV vaccine, the combination vaccine for measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox, to kids under 4. So that just happened. But I really want to zoom out from the day-to-day. And I was really struck earlier today. We had a conversation at the Atlantic Festival with Dimitri Daskalakis, the CDC's lead infectious disease doctor who resigned last month. He said the CDC is over as we know it. And Dan, I want to start with you. Based on your reporting and what you're seeing, what do you think of what he said? Is that your read as well?
Oh, the CDC is over?
As we know it.
Well, it is changed dramatically. I mean, even just I've been watching this meeting, advisory committee meeting that you were talking about, and it is just, it's total mayhem, right? There's confusion about what the process is, about what is being voted on, whether the issues being voted on are in actually the purview of that committee or not at all. This is separate from the question of what are the policies that are being pursued. There's just chaos in terms of the process.
So tell me a little bit more about that. We were talking backstage a little bit about the chaos. Like, for instance, what happened? I know that there was a little bit of confusion yesterday in just voting on this MMRV vaccine. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, so at the end of the day yesterday, you mentioned they had voted to remove the recommendation that children under 4 can choose to take the MMRV vaccine, or their families can choose to take that for the first dose. It's very technical. I mean, I think I saw some coverage of this that if you looked at it quickly, you would think kids are not going to have access to MMR. That's not true. It was just, when you're a baby, are you going to get the MMR in one shot and chickenpox in the other shot on the same day, just in different arms, or are you going to get them in the same vial in the same arm? So in a way, it's a minor point. 85% of the children who get immunized end up choosing the separate shots. So, okay, small point, but they voted to change the recommendation for this, and then moments later, they had a follow-up vote about whether the Vaccines for Children program would have the same recommendation. There's just no reason in the world why you would want to have one recommendation that's sort of in general and a separate one for the Vaccine for Children program. And yet they voted totally opposite. It was like 8-3 in favor of the first one and then 8-2 against the second one. And what we ended up with temporarily, they revisited it this morning, is a situation where there's a different recommendation, national recommendation for what vaccines small children should get based on whether they happen to be covered by this one, mechanism for covering shots or another mechanism. So it was just an example of just confusion as opposed to ideology or reform.
Yeah, so speaking of, there is a lot of confusion. And Nick, I was hoping you could talk a little about how it feels like there's this balkanization of vaccine recommendations, and the states are seeming to kind of take some of this into their own hands. So talk a little bit about the confusion of what's coming down from the national level, what's happening on the state level, maybe talk a little bit about what states are doing what.
Sure. I mean, it's fascinating because we saw RFK Jr. fire all the members of the ACIP, this panel that we've been talking about, and he said that was to restore trust. But in reality, what we've seen is that trust has just dropped precipitously in a very short amount of time. And now we have states saying, we aren't going to follow the ACIP's recommendations. The Western states in particular say they're going to put out their own recommendations for vaccination. We're seeing the same thing with doctors groups. We're seeing the American Academy of Pediatrics saying they aren't going to follow ACIP. They aren't going to participate in the meetings. And this kind of sounds like, kind of the infighting we've been dealing with COVID for the last few years. But it's really hard to overstate how quickly things have changed. I mean, ACIP was considered a very, very well regarded impartial panel, and that's just completely gone away.
So yeah, I mean, can you actually also talk a little bit about this trust situation? I mean, is the trust that we currently have in vaccines, I mean, I think a lot of people are questioning, because there is this these different recommendations coming from different places. Like, talk a little bit about what this erosion in trust is doing, just more generally.
Yeah, I mean, it feels, frankly, like it's part of the strategy. It depends on how you think about the motivations here. But I mean, seeing these panels debate these little areas of vaccine policy, such as whether you should get MMRV in 1 dose or 2, it just creates confusion, I think, for parents. And that's what we heard yesterday from a lot of the liaison and public health folks that were on the call, was essentially, why are we doing this? Like, what is the purpose here? Because we're just going to make kids more and more worried. And I think, actually, if you couple this with the hearing that happened on Wednesday with the fired CDC director, it's really fascinating.
Can you talk just pause on that and just say a little bit about what happened with that?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, on Wednesday, the fired CDC director, Susan Monterez, testified before the Senate. And it was fascinating because it really provided a window into sort of how RFK is thinking about the CDC. And frankly, if even half of what she said is true about what RFK told her, I mean, it's very clear that RFK has deep, deep suspicion of the CDC. She said that RFK told her that the CDC is the most corrupt health agency in the history of the world, and that CDC officials were killing babies, was her words. So, I mean, even half of that is true. We can really see how RFK feels about this agency.
Okay, I do want to actually zoom out even more, since we're talking about, RFK and his influence and his impact right now on HHS. Yasmin, I actually want to come out to the kind of, can science be trusted idea of things. There's been, and I'm going to veer away from vaccines because we could spend the whole time talking about it. But what I wanted to talk about is just, health initiatives a little more broadly. There's been a lot of news, TikTok discourse, whatever it is you want to call it, about seed oils being bad or raw milk being good. And, there's all sorts of information out there. So, first of all, I'm just curious to know, you've done some reporting on these issues. What is your reporting telling you about some of this? And, how can we, when we're being, inundated with so much misinformation, try and figure out what is true, what isn't true, where, there are probably parts of this discourse that, are worth questioning. So, yeah, how can we navigate this?
It's really hard. We are clear on some things. Raw milk can cause very serious, potentially fatal illness. So don't drink raw milk. Seed oils, despite all these restaurants saying they're going to switch to beef tallow, there's, for those of you who don't know, there's a pretty widespread belief that seed oils, which refers to oils pressed from seeds, canola, sunflower, a lot of common ones, are toxic by virtue of the way that they're made. And so the response from those who are aligned with MAHA, the Make America Healthy Again agenda, and Kennedy, are like, let's go back to the most natural fat, beef tallow, so like beef fat. And the research just does not bear out, A, that seed oils are toxic, and B, that switching to animal fat is going to be any healthier for you. We know that eating animal fat is going to give you higher levels of saturated fat, and that's not great for your heart. So a few things we are very clear on. But to zoom out, it's a really, really confusing misinformation landscape in general, and food very much so. I think that's kind of by design, I think people rightfully feel worried and nervous. They feel like they've been misled by whoever's in charge of their health because they feel sick. They feel like their children are getting sick. This is core to the Make America Healthy Again strategy. The problem is that fear creates an environment in which people are just willing to believe anything, especially simple, attractive ideas that are easy to latch onto, like just get rid of your seed oils, just eat beef tallow, just drink raw milk. Let's go back to natural. It seems intuitive, it's attractive when people are scared. And, unfortunately, it's just an amazing environment for falsehoods to spread.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I'm just the piece of this I feel like that is so tragic, though, is the fact that RFK is rightfully recognized that food can have a profound impact on our health. And there are pieces of the MAHA agenda and his focus on food that are worth considering. And this idea generally that we're suffering from chronic diseases in this country and that we can solve some of them with changing our diet, I think is well-founded. It's just unfortunate that that has been peppered with all these pieces of misinformation like the ones Yasmin mentioned.
Well, talk a little bit about what are some of the things, to be at the most generous, are there good ideas and good things in his platform that we can get behind? I mean, what are some of the things that, are worth questioning? Yeah,
I think his work on food dyes is worth at least taking seriously. He's argued that we should be getting rid of synthetic food dyes. There are some data that suggest that certain kids who are susceptible do have ADHD-like reactions to these dyes when they consume them. And also these dyes aren't used in most of Europe. So there's a question of, should we really be using them? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Does the candy need to be bright red if we know that even a subset of kids might have a bad reaction to it? And I think RFK has also picked up on, for example, this idea of paying for soda in food stamps. There can be an argument to be made that folks should have their own autonomy to pick what they eat, but I think he's right to at least focus in on and say, hey, there's certain foods we know are not good for our diet. Should we be paying for them with government money, with programs that are supposed to create and give people access to nutritious food?
Well, can you go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in. I think those two examples you just gave are perfectly illustrate why RFK is so maddening. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, you have limiting purchases of junk food. I think we can all get behind that. That seems fine. The food dyes thing, it just irritates me so much because it's yeah, sure, let's take them out, but it's such a distraction from all of the other things that make people unhealthy. If you take out the orange from Doritos, it's still Doritos. Yep. And yet this is the thing he keeps crowing about. In fact, the food dye thing is pretty much the only actual change he's made. Yeah. And it's not even a real policy change. It's a handshake agreement with companies to phase out dyes.
We actually wrote recently, Nick, about that there are all these recommendations and how hard it's going to be to track them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the administration put out what they call their MAHA strategy. If I remember the number right, I think it's 128 recommendations. Some of them are things that can be done relatively quickly. For example, RFK has said by the end of the year, he wants to close this loophole in FDA rules that allow companies to introduce new food additives without oversight from the FDA. It's the sort of thing that can be done with a regulation. It'll take some time, but can happen in a year as opposed to a long time. And then there's other recommendations that essentially are we need to be researching how different environmental toxins build up in the body and relate to one another and impact our health. That's obviously something that's going to take a lot longer. But I mean, the strategy is interesting because I feel like the administration should be given some credit for actually putting together a to-do list, essentially, that we're going to be able to then say, did you do this, did you do this, did you do this? They are setting clear goals, and we can hold them to those goals, which I think is interesting.
Is this something that we're going to have the funding and the science and the research to be able to actually track those things?
Probably not. I think it's going to depend on folks like us three to be sort of paying attention to what is actually happening and calling out when things aren't happening.
So one other thing I wanted to ask Yasmin, ask you about is sunscreen. I feel like that's another one of those that kind of lives in the raw milk and food dye universe. Yes. You know, I mean, at its best, people are saying that it's you know, bad, and you know, at the worst, people say it has, you know, cancer-causing elements to it. How did we get to this place where we're arguing about sunscreen, which feels pretty basic? Like, I think all of us have been told to wear sunscreen for our whole life.
You know, I think I'm a millennial. I grew up in an age where it's like, yeah, put on the sunscreen, otherwise you'll get skin cancer, which is still true. But I think two things are happening here. One is this, like, again, the misinformation about sunscreen, that is, a lot of it is based in sort of corporate suspicion. You know, one message I keep seeing in these videos is like, the sun doesn't cause cancer. Sunscreen causes cancer. And they just want you to buy more sunscreen. And like that's part of it. But I also think with the sunscreen thing, there's like, almost like a more like spiritual agenda. So what I mean is that, you know, this pushback against sunscreen in some cases goes as far as not only should you not use sunscreen, but you should be out in the sun. Like Casey Means, who is the nominee for Surgeon General, in her book, a bestseller, she writes about how Americans are like in a spiritual crisis because they've been separated from their biological needs, such as sunlight. And so there's this like bigger push to, again, like return to nature, you know, go back to our roots, get rid of all the industrial stuff. And I think that's really appealing to a lot of people. And so the misinformation combined with that, you know, desire, I think creates a perfect environment for falsehoods about sunscreen to spread. So, you know, one of the concerns is that sunscreen contains chemicals that cause cancer. We don't really have too much data on this. We know that sunscreen can get into the bloodstream, but only, like the chemicals in sunscreen can get to the bloodstream, but only in studies where it's used like in huge amounts that nobody ever uses. There was a recall a few years ago of sunscreen tainted with benzene, a known carcinogen, but that seems to have been like a one-time thing, and the benzene was not supposed to be in the sunscreen. But you know, it's so easy for these events to be taken completely out of context.
Right, so kind of to get back to what you were saying about how maddening it is. I mean, look, it's great. I think being in the sun is great. No one would argue with that, right? So you kind of have like this germ of truth mixed with, you know, all this other information. It starts to kind of all feel like noise. So Dan, I was hoping that maybe you could unpack a little bit about, you know, how do we separate some of this noise and what the movement is saying from like what is actually really happening and the real behavior of the administration?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I was just thinking about the title of this panel, the RFK Jr. Revolution. I mean, that's like almost Maha branding. It sounds like a new diet or something. And I think it's an important question, like how much is it revolutionary, and what are the terms of the uprising within public health? And so on one level, there's a lot of things that are said as if they're revolutionary that aren't. For example, Nick brought up, need to focus on chronic disease and how people's diets affect their health, as if this hasn't been, you know, a primary topic of public health discussion for decades. Or, you know, trying to limit soda consumption, or even artificial food dyes. I mean, these are just like they're standbys, they're politically popular So part of this, there's just no revolution. But there is a revolution happening in terms of almost where we started with, where processes are being overturned. And you have a group of people in charge who are, dedicated contrarians who define their goals as being to upend groupthink in public health. And groupthink is wherever you find it. Like, what's an established principle of how people should be happy? We're against it. And so I think that's sort of the key for figuring out what's, in a sense, the signal and what's the noise. I think you can ignore the bromides about how we are going to improve health in a way that no one has ever considered before and focus on what are the specific issues where, again, there was a consensus and now we're going to push to argue the exact opposite and change the mechanisms of policymaking so that we can get there.
I think the one revolutionary piece of it is the fact that we're talking about all of this in a Republican administration. I mean, these are the issues that I was talking to public health, like full lefty public health folks a year or two ago. And now we're seeing, suspicion of corporations like Coca-Cola coming from a Republican Health and Human Services Secretary. So that realignment is super interesting, but I also think it's a question of, does it stay that way once RFK is off, out of the spotlight? And whether the Republican Party continues to push towards MAHA, or it goes away when RFK goes away.
So because it's created these strange bedfellows of sorts, do you think that it makes the coalition and the staying power of it stronger?
In Washington, probably not. I mean, it definitely it's an interesting situation when you think of sort of like MAHA Democrats. I think a lot about this, folks who have been pushing these same ideas and sort of how do they deal with RFK. And we haven't really tested it though, to be honest, because like Yasmin said, we haven't really seen a lot of policy making. We've seen policy making on the state level where we are seeing some bipartisanship and coalitions forming. But on the national stage, we really just have had RFK using his bully pulpit to try to push policies through. So we haven't really tested how Democrats in particular will respond to RFK if he says, hey, I need a new law on school lunch, for example.
Well, let's do a quick lightning round here to close us out. And I'll just go down the path here. What is a thing that is giving you a little bit of hope, and what is a thing that's keeping you up at night? Let's start with keeping you up at night and end on hope. How about that?
Wait, I have to flip them because mine are, I think they can be related.
Okay.
So the thing that I think is encouraging is that people are starting to recognize that food can drive health outcomes. I mean, that food, I hate this term because I think it overstates it, but sort of food is medicine. I think that the fact that we're talking about diet is important, but the thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that people are going to take that to the furthest extreme and say, food is medicine and I don't need real medicine. It's very easy for the pendulum to swing too far.
Right. Yasmin.
You stole mine. There aren't that many things to feel hopeful about. Okay, I have a second one. I feel, are we starting with the bad one? Okay.
Start wherever you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thing that keeps me up at night. In my decade as a science journalist, I've always felt confident that, what I was writing, talking to experts, scientific experts, represented like an opinion that the majority believed in. People trust scientists for expertise. I worry about the day that we hit a tipping point and I'm writing from a minority position. That freaks me out. Okay, what I'm hopeful about, some states are making vaccine access, are expanding vaccine access. I think that response is great.
That's great. Dan.
I guess I'll just do one that's kind of a double whammy, picking up on what Yasmin was saying. I think what keeps me up at night sometimes about the public health system in the United States is how distributed it is, and that can cause problems and make it harder to get vaccination rates up, for example, as compared to countries where there's a really strong centralized system. But it also gives me hope right at this very moment that because of that distributed public health authority, you can have this committee that is falling apart in front of our eyes, and it's, how much power do they really have? I mean, there are very important things they can do, but you can see just immediate pushback, resilience, flexibility in the system as a result of the distributed public health authority in the United States.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Still to come on the Being Human stage, Aric Prather answers your questions about sleep. For a conversation produced by our underwriter, Eli Lilly and Company, about redefining brain health, the future of Alzheimer's diagnosis and care, please welcome Ann E. White, Executive Vice President and President of Lilly Neuroscience at Eli Lilly and Company, with the Atlantic's Chief Growth Officer, Megha Garibaldi.
Thank you for being with us today, everyone, and Anne. So let's kick this off, and let's actually start with your personal experience. You've been open about your experience with your own mother and the challenges that you faced as she experienced memory and thinking issues. Can you share how that personal experience has shaped your work and your commitment in Alzheimer's disease and care?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today, and it's great to be with all of you. Yes, I lost my mom to Alzheimer's disease. It's over 15 years ago now, but she and I were very close. As I was growing up, I would always considered her my best friend, and in fact, she moved in with us, and my twins were born. They were born prematurely, and they needed a lot of care, so she moved in with us and helped care for them. That's the kind of mom that she was. And actually, just a few years later, she didn't recognize them. She would ask me who those children were, these kids that she had helped taken care of. So it was an incredible, painful journey for us. But what gives me hope is that the journey that she had and the journey that she would have today are two very different ones. When she was diagnosed, there was no hope for treatment for her disease. In fact, even her diagnosis was not made until after she passed away. So that's the kind of journey that she was on. And there certainly was a lot of stigma about Alzheimer's disease, and we didn't talk about her diagnosis very broadly. But today, such a different space. There's hope with treatments for early symptomatic disease. There are blood tests that actually can be used to diagnose the pathology of the disease, and conversations like this that I think help destigmatize the disease in important ways. So it's great to be here to talk about it with you.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's great to hear the sense of hope, right? So can you talk to us a little bit more about, there's been the approval of amyloid targeting therapies and the blood biomarker tests that you just mentioned. How are these exactly reshaping how we are approaching care now?
Yeah. Well, probably important to talk about amyloid for a minute, because you may have heard of the term amyloid, and amyloid is a protein that naturally produces in your body. So all of us have a certain level of amyloid. But what happens with Alzheimer's disease is that essentially it starts to clump together to form plaques. And when you get these excessive plaques in your brain, that's what can cause the memory and thinking issues. So now what we have for a certain stage of the disease are amyloid-targeted therapies. So they target the amyloid and clear it out. And what they're able to do then is to potentially slow the progression of the disease. So this, in the last few years, that's the first time that we've ever had a treatment that has the potential to really modify the disease. There were medicines that maybe could treat the symptoms, but not the disease itself. So that's exciting. And then also exciting is the progress on the diagnosis. So as I said, many years ago, maybe over 15 years ago, the diagnosis was through autopsy. Then we had the efforts around PET scans, so you could get PET scans to get diagnosed with amyloid pathology, or lumbar punctures. But think about the two of those. They're fairly invasive. They can be expensive. So what I'm excited about now is the advent of blood biomarkers. And not just because it's a simple blood test that could potentially diagnose the pathology, but also it's a very scalable test that many people around the world, around the country, that may not have access to some of the other methods could get treated. And it's so important with this disease to get treated as early as possible when you see that those symptoms are upon you.
Right, and so let's talk about research then, right? So Alzheimer's research is now pushing into earlier and even incredibly asymptomatic stages of the disease. So what are we learning from these studies, and how might this shift the future of prevention and early detection?
Yeah, this is what gets me really excited. Obviously, I love the progress we've made, but the goal is always to make more of a difference, move earlier, and that's with any disease that you can think of. The earlier that you might treat, the better people may do. And we hope that the same is in Alzheimer's disease. So we've got studies across the field going on right now, not just at Lilly, but across the space, around treating people that don't have any symptoms yet, but have that pathology of Alzheimer's disease in their brain. Because the fact is that amyloid plaques can start forming 10 to 20 years before you start to see symptoms. And so our hope across the field is that if we can clear these amyloid plaques at that earliest stage, maybe we can even delay the onset of symptoms for many patients. Maybe even some people don't progress to symptoms within their lifetime. That would be incredible. But then there's also research ongoing. Can you even reduce the risk of Alzheimer's in your lifetime? And so there was a great study by the Alzheimer's Association at a recent conference that showed, it was called the Pointer Study, if you're interested in learning more, but about aspects of exercise and diet, brain exercises, and social interaction. All of those can help. This was shown that a combination of these in a set of older adults could actually reduce the risk of cognitive decline in later in life. And I think we've been reading about this for some time right now, that sleep, diet, exercise, it makes sense in everything that we treat, but it certainly makes sense also in Alzheimer's disease, that if we can reduce that risk, that's something that's very meaningful, and we can take action on those things today.
So as Alzheimer's treatments and diagnostics gain FDA approval, which is incredible,
Yep.
Patients and providers still, though, face some challenges. Low awareness, delayed detection. So what are the most pressing challenges that we need to urgently address to ensure that these innovations are actually reaching the people who need them?
Yeah. Well, I think conversations like this are important, and I appreciate all of you coming today, because the number one thing is awareness. Awareness that we need to start talking about our brain health, that we need to start speaking up if we see that either ourselves or people that we love have issues. But it is challenging. I mean, there are medicines out there now to treat a certain stage of the disease, but many doctors even are not aware, let alone patients. So I think that awareness is part of it. But then also, we did some interesting analyses lately. We looked back at kind of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and you can get information out of health records and things like that. And it tells us that, essentially claims data, that tells us that only about 15% of people that are eventually diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease ever got to see a specialist in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. So meaning many of them stayed with primary care or someone else. And that may not be the best care that they can receive when they've got that diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And then only if you did get to a specialist, this one really surprised me, only about 5% of those patients actually got one of these tests that I told you about for diagnosing the pathology of Alzheimer's, whether it's a PET scan or a blood test. Only 5%. So that tells you that there's a lot of work to do to drive awareness in this disease. And so having conversations like this, all of you leaving the room and making people more aware is incredibly important in the treatment of this disease.
So speaking about awareness, last week Lilly announced a partnership with Julianne Moore and a new public health campaign to raise awareness. Can you tell us a bit more about the campaign and its importance?
Yes, we're really excited to encourage conversation about brain health. Our hope is that people will prioritize brain health the same way that you do your heart health and many other things that we do prioritize today, or at least maybe that we intend to prioritize most of the time, but move that up on the list. And so we are particularly excited to partner with Julianne, because you may remember about 10 years ago, she won an Academy Award for her work in Still Alice, where she portrayed someone with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And she did an incredible job. And one thing that she shared with us, and when we approached her, was the research that she'd done for that role. She'd really gone out and spoken to healthcare providers, Alzheimer's patients, Alzheimer's Association, all of those groups, to make sure that she really understood how to portray this, and did such a fabulous job that she won an Oscar for that. So I think having her talk about this with that research that she'd done, and I think she became a passionate advocate at that point for brain health. And so we're encouraging people to talk about taking charge of your brain health and looking for ways to reduce the risk, and particularly being an advocate with your doctor. So asking for a cognitive assessment, coming up with a plan with your doctor about your brain health and your cognitive health, making a plan so that you can do the things that might lower your risk. So glad she's partnered up with us, and she's actually going to be in the next session. So if you're here now, I encourage you to stay, because even more eloquently than me, I think she can speak about the passion she has for taking charge of our health, our brain health, and doing it in a way that really can have some great results. So,
well, thank you so much for having this important conversation with us.
Yes.
And thank you to everyone here.
Thank you.
Here to discuss the science behind sleep, please welcome Aric Prather, UCSF professor, sleep scientist, and author, with Atlantic staff writer Nicholas Florko.
Hi, everyone. I was hoping to actually start this session with a little bit of audience engagement, I guess. I'm curious, we're talking about sleep here, and I'm curious if I can see you all. With a show of hands, how many people sleep between 7 and 8 hours a night? Okay, good amount.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah, what about less than 5? Anyone? Okay, a few. And what about more than 10? No one's getting more than 10, as I can see. Oh, no, a few, okay. And how many of you take either a prescription sleep medication or an herbal sleep aid? That's a good amount of people, okay. So, I mean, it's clear, at least from those answers, that, sleep is elusive for some folks in the audience. And I really want to dive into sort of how we deal with that. But first, I'm hoping, Aric, you can help us understand just like the biological importance of sleep, why we need it, and how much we need.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for the participation. Raise your hand if you like sleeping. It is so important to us. It's like built into our DNA. It's critical and a pillar for health. The truth is that kind of when we don't get the sleep we need, we feel it, right? We know it. People who, when we get the right amount, people are kind of the best versions of themselves, right? We're kind of better partners, we're better parents, we're better workers. We have kind of the emotional regulation that we need to kind of deal with the slings and arrows of kind of the stressors of our day. And so it's fundamental, right? It does so many different things. And we've been on this quest as sleep scientists to really understand why we sleep. It turns out we sleep for lots of reasons. It's really important for our brain. You hear about brain health. It's really important for kind of the way in which we deal with the world and interact with others. It's important for our immune system. It's important for our metabolism. It's important for how we regulate our blood pressure. And so it really has this clear kind of biological necessity, what makes us human, which makes sleep so important to this kind of being human session. With respect to how much sleep we need, I think the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the Sleep Research Society, recommend that to maintain optimal adult health, people get at least 7 hours per night. So, a lot of you are in that group. I think the important thing is, and so I run a insomnia clinic in San Francisco, and, there turns out that there's a lot of variability in how much sleep people need. So we have this recommendation based on kind of population level information. But it can definitely vary, and so a lot of people that come into our clinic, not a lot, but many, are really worried about not hitting that number, and that's causing them anxiety and making it hard for them to sleep. And so some people get by at 6 hours. Some people, if you feel good, it might be sufficient. It's when you're really starting to experience that kind of just not feeling restored, or noticing some of these daytime symptoms where you really need to begin to think, what's going on with my sleep?
If sleep is so fundamental to our health, why is it, do you think, that so many people have trouble doing it?
That's a great question. And I think, so I always tell people that when they're struggling with their sleep, sleep is one of those things that we never even wonder how it works until it stops working. And then you become very focused on it. And it turns out that sleep isn't something that you make happen. And trust, in the western part of the world, and in the US in particular, we're kind of doers, we're fixers, right? And when something's wrong, we kind of snap into action. And when people's sleep is kind of disrupted, it's very jarring. It feels something like your sleep is broken. And so people really try to, attack the problem. But it turns out sleep is something that gets harder as you kind of try to pull it towards you. You're actually kind of pushing it away, and the things that people do when they can't sleep in the moment makes tons of sense. Like, maybe going to bed earlier, or taking that nap because you feel, terrible, or, starting to kind of change your behaviors in ways that might help you sleep that night, but actually undermine how sleep works naturally. And so, in the long run, it can actually make your sleep a lot worse, and, people will struggle because of it.
I am personally curious how much you think insomnia is something that's mental. Because for me, at least personally, we talked backstage, I had a huge issue for a while with insomnia, and I noticed the thing that was throwing me off the most was that during the day, I was worrying, I hope I sleep tonight. I hope I sleep tonight.
Yeah.
And it started to become this anticipatory anxiety, which then is self-fulfilling. Is that usually what's happening?
Yeah, so, bad nights of sleep happen to everybody, right? Like, who had a bad night of sleep last night? I was doing this, come on, like look, these lights, come on, this is like a thing for me. And so of course I didn't sleep well. And so, we have bad nights of sleep, but it's when it compounds on itself that people really do get to worry that am I ever gonna sleep again? And then they do start putting a lot of mental effort. And I have so many patients that'll say things like, I was feeling sleepy before I got in bed, and then as soon as I got in bed, my brain woke up. And that what happens with insomnia is kind of people have so many nights of poor sleep that things that are tied to their environment, their bedroom environment, like their bed or their bedroom, actually become environmental triggers for wakefulness. And so it's called a conditioned arousal. And so, those sorts of things, when they happen, create kind of this physiologic response, like our stress response, right? Which is important for certain scenarios, like where you need to, say you have a new baby and you need to keep yourself awake, and you have to kind of, be able to get the energy to do that through kind of your adrenaline and your cortisol and all that kind of stuff. But, when it's not that, but that system is still happening, people are just kind of tired but wired.
I want this to be helpful for the audience that sleeps well as well. So one of the things that struck me in your book is you talk about sort of the importance of a wind down routine. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through what that is and sort of what a good wind down routine looks like. Because it feels like the sort of thing you can do even if you don't have a sleep disorder.
Sure. So, there's so many parts of the 24-hour day that you can use to try to, facilitate a good night of sleep, or increase the chances of it. And the truth is that, a lot of us walk around acting as if our brains are kind of laptops, where it's okay, we're gonna fire off that last email, and then we're just gonna close the laptop and get in bed, and then we're just gonna snap it off and go to sleep. But it's not, evolutionarily, that's not how we've developed. The technology has advanced faster than kind of our brains can change. And so as a consequence, we do need to kind of build in this transition time, a way to kind of bookend the day, right? To cue your body that okay, we're done with work, we're done with the daily life, and now we're gonna kind of go into our sleeping life, which, creates so many important things for our biology that we only do during sleep. And so, building that in is really important. And so even for people that are sleeping generally well, having those rituals that people will do to kind of help wind down, it almost in some ways doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's sort of kind of relaxing for you. I mean, in general, clinically, we suggest that people kind of take the last hour and do something kind for yourself, kind of stop with work, stop with things that are activating, right? Do things that are kind of positive and kind of treat yourself experience, so that you can, and if you do that consistently, your body will realize that oh, this is a cue that we're kind of moving into this time of day. And so some people will take a bath, some people just watch a TV show with their loved ones, or by themselves, or read a book, or any of those things. I always think that the things that people do to wind down, it's universal that we need them, but it's also really personal. I used to think that reading, for me, it's 2 pages, I'm oh my God, I just gotta just go to sleep. But then I had all these patients that were super bookworms, right? And they're just devouring books, and I'm oh my God, this is not working, and I they come back and how are you sleeping this week? And they're well, I'm not sleeping any better, but you wouldn't believe how many books I've read this week. And I'm so, in that way, it was not a good fit. And so maybe for them, it's a meditation, or listening to a podcast, or, something like that helps, really trying to grease the wheels with helping you wind down. But it is important to have that space. I think that's the key thing, creating this space to allow your body to do what it's built to do, which is to sleep.
Are screens actually a problem? Because I feel like that's the thing we hear the most is like, don't use your phone, don't watch TV.
Yeah.
I sleep next to my phone. Like sometimes it's in the bed with me. So I need to know how bad that actually is.
Yeah. So that's a great point. And our thinking around this has changed over time. I mean, often what you heard about with screens is the blue light, right? So the reason that is concerning is because that wavelength of light actually is picked up in your brain and can actually shut down the production of melatonin. So melatonin, a lot of people know about, is kind of a supplement that you can take to help you sleep. Your brain actually makes it. It's an endogenous hormone, and it's made under darkness. And it doesn't make you go to sleep, but it kind of sets the table for that. And so, the concern was like, oh, well, this blue light's going to shut that down. That's going to keep people awake. That's why screens are bad. And so, devices have created filters, industries have been grown to make glasses, all of those things to address that. But, the truth is that, by and large, it's often the content that people are devouring that's keeping them awake. I mean, if we think about social media, which I've heard a lot about in this conference already, it's developed to keep you engaged. Right? And so it's hitting that kind of giving that dopamine hit, that reward system in your brain that is part and parcel with your arousal system in your brain. And so, if you have this blue light filter on, but you're like streaming through 2 hours of TikTok, it's not the blue light, and so it's those things that can be problematic. And again, it's not the case for everyone. Like my wife, she watches Instagram, and then next thing I know, she's asleep with the phone in her hand, and and I'm not a sleep scientist, right? So I'm pulling it out, and she's like, don't talk about that on stage, and I was like, okay, I won't, but it's that kind of thing, and so it absolutely can be a problem, right? And if you wake up in the middle of the night and your first instinct is oh my God, I got to see what happened in the news, what new terrible thing happened? It's that can kind of drive arousal and sleep problems, but it's often being careful about the content that usually is at the heart of it.
Are there other things that you find that frequently deprive people of sleep or rob them of good sleep? I think if we think about what is necessary for a good night's sleep, there are a lot of environmental things that do that, so. And I think one of the things that I've historically been really interested in is that kind of the variation in kind of sleep opportunity across populations. So it turns out that the opportunity to sleep, which I believe is a human right, is not evenly distributed. And a lot of that is due to factors outside of the control of the individual. So the environment in which they live or the job in which they have to have. Underemployment or shift work or light pollution or living in an unsafe environment or crowding within multiple people in a room that creates crowding or temperature that you can't control. All of those things rob people of sleep. And the good news is a lot of those things, not all of them, but some of them are kind of addressable. And so that's where it happens. There's also, I think the other thing is sleep changes across the life course, and so this is why there's been such a push towards around changing school start times, right? Because adolescents go through a phase shift of their circadian rhythm to where they're more delayed, right? They want to go to bed later, but school start times are early, and so ultimately they're being robbed of sleep opportunity because of that. And so all of those things, I think, are culprits for some. Makes sense. Obviously, a lot of folks in the audience raised their hands about using either prescription sleep medications or herbal supplements. What's your take on those and whether we should be using them, I guess?
Yeah, so, it's amazing that we have these tools. Pharmaceutical medications like hypnotics, like Ambien, or any of the other ones that are on the market, have a place for kind of acute use. What we worry about is the chronic use of these things because they may have risks for people with respect to, say, long-term use in their brain health, or as we get older, fall risks because you're kind of so sleepy. With respect to supplements, there is kind of a dearth of efficacy data, which is not because we don't want to do the studies. It's often that no one will pay for us to do them. But I think they need to be kind of vetted. And then there's an issue around kind of the regulation of them, right? So if they don't go through the same regulatory pipelines, when you learn something about anything, any of those types of things, I mean, so I've run into this in the context of like CBD or THC supplements. So it's like, and that's like the most common thing. So I'm in San Francisco, and that's like the most common thing that people come in asking about. And the truth is we don't know, because even if we do a study on one individual one, we don't know for sure that someone could even get that, in a different place. And so then we're kind of stuck with that. I think the thing that, cuts across all of it, though, is this idea that though these, whether it's a supplement or it's a pharmaceutical, they may not be physiologically addicting necessarily. I mean, some are, like benzodiazepines, certainly you kind of like build up tolerance and things like that. But they're almost immediately psychologically addicting, that people really begin to question whether they can sleep without them, right? And they'll be in the back of their mind every, multiple nights a week thinking like, should I just take it? I mean, and then you get into this cycle and then, it's one thing to the next where you then start thinking like, I don't know if I can sleep without this thing. And that's a challenge. And so, the good news is that the actual gold standard treatment for insomnia is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI, and it's kind of non-medicine based, it's behavioral. And so that actually addresses the underlying problems of insomnia, the things that kind of perpetuate it, where pharmaceutical medications or supplements kind of just mask the symptom. But can people get that? It's a challenge of access. Digital therapeutics are coming on board, which is really exciting because it's certainly not rocket science. I wouldn't run our clinic if it was. I can only do certain things, but it's actually incredibly effective. And so my hope is that more people can get that.
Are there pieces of CBTI that you think that everyday sleepers can incorporate to improve their sleep?
100%. So, right. So anyone that wants to improve their sleep, the first thing I always tell them, in addition to kind of ensuring their sleep environment is adequate, right? So it's cool, it's dark, it's quiet, it feels safe, I think is a really important one that people don't talk about. And then you're not kind of like sabotaging yourself with stimulants or alcohol, where it's like, okay, well, you do that, like what do you think was gonna happen with your sleep? It's not gonna help. Is to actually standardize your wake up time 7 days a week. And that's a hard one. People don't love that. It takes a lot of time for me to kind of build up to that, to tell people that news. But it's actually something like you can. So I think it comes from the place where, sleep, again, as I said before, sleep isn't something that you make happen, right? Like you can't do it on demand. The thing you can't control though is when you wake up. And because the biology that regulates our sleep are kind of two primary factors: our circadian rhythm, or our internal clock, kind of like our tendency to want to be up and, at certain times. And then your homeostatic sleep drive, which I think of as kind of like a balloon that kind of starts when you wake up, it's flat, and like a balloon's flat, and then it kind of fills up with sleepiness as you kind of go throughout the day. And then when it gets to like this optimal amount, like you feel these sleepy cues and you go to sleep and your circadian rhythm, you're making the melatonin, and you have a good restorative night of sleep. And so if you maintain your wake up time 7 days a week, your rhythm and your balloon will start filling up the same way each day. And that just seems to produce more predictability for people. It doesn't mean that you can't sleep on the weekends, but these like big shifts, like we're talking multiple hours, one can throw off your circadian rhythm. Your balloon starts filling at a different rate. And, it may actually give you some information about like, what the hell is going on during your week? Like, why are you only getting 4 hours of sleep? And trying to figure out how to better adjust those things. But that's the number one thing. I think I know we're short on time, but the second thing that is really important, in addition to the wind down that we already talked about, is if you're not able to sleep, don't lay in bed tossing and turning. And that's another hard one. And the reason for that is because the more you do that, the more you confuse your body and mind about kind of what you're supposed to be doing in bed. Like it turns out that like people who don't have sleep problems, like they're sleepy before they go to bed, but when they get in bed, it's like a hammer coming down on them. It's like, like as their head is getting closer to the pillow, it's like, like you're like losing consciousness. And that's because their body knows what's supposed to happen. Like it's a cue, an environmental cue that helps kind of you transition that way. And so the more that you spend time like tossing and turning and angsty and all this kind of stuff, it gets, over time it becomes fractured. And then you have to kind of rebuild that. And so that's part of CBTI is stimulus control therapy, but just like not getting into that mode. And so the goal is like, if it's like 20 minutes and you're just like still not asleep, maybe you kind of like get out of bed and kind of read until you feel sleepy again and get back in bed. Or if you can't do that, if like, it snows here, so like people don't want to do that in winter, you could at least like sit all the way up or move to the other side of the bed. Something that cues your body that this isn't the same as sleep. And then when you feel sleepy, kind of get back in there and try to get to sleep.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there, but I could talk to you all day about different tips, personally. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
For a conversation produced by our underwriter, Gilead Sciences, about redefining care, the future of women's health and rare disease innovation, please welcome Betty Chang, Vice President of U.S. Medical Affairs Virology at Gilead Sciences, and Janae Van den Ende, Vice President of U.S. Medical Affairs at Gilead Sciences.
I feel guilty that I'm not working. I'm guilty about not being able to do so much around the house. I see the worry on my boys' faces sometimes. Over this last year, I have become more aware of what I can and can't do. I'm not as hard on myself as I would have been at the beginning. Only one of the GPs that I see at my surgery seems to know anything about it. If I haven't had a sleep in the afternoon, I just feel in a bad mood. I've got pains as well. My body doesn't do what it used to do. When I'm walking upstairs, I sometimes feel like my legs are in mud and I can't lift them out. There's been a couple of PBC conferences that we've been at, but you want more people around you who know what you're going through, and I think that has been helpful to meet those people.
First and the individual first, because that's the one thing that we do every single day as Gilead is how do we make people's lives better? And I know a lot of you have heard about many diseases. If I say to you, who's heard about diabetes? Okay. If I say, who's heard about HIV? Okay, those are common. Diabetes, 38 million odd people in the US of A has got diabetes. But here we're talking about a disease called PBC. Who knows what PBC is? Wow. Okay, primary biliary cholangitis. Big mouthful. So I'm going to ask Betty to give us a little bit of more information about PBC.
So if you look at the word PBC, I actually will start with the fact that it stands for primary, being the first, biliary, which is just your bile ducts, and cholangitis, which is inflammation of your bile ducts. What's interesting is when we went to go look at PBC, they used to actually call it primary biliary cirrhosis, because that's how people showed up. They came in with advanced disease where their liver was already damaged, that to the point that some actually needed a liver transplant.
And Betty, we know the liver is quite resilient. So.
Oh yeah, we do. I think every one of us test it out several times a day, and see what our livers can do, right? Mm-hmm. But there is a point where it doesn't do so well.
So you need, 70 to 80% of the liver damage before you start getting signs of liver disease?
Yeah, you need a significant amount. So with this primary biliary cirrhosis, cholangitis, you may not even realize. In fact, 60% of people don't even realize that they don't have any symptoms at all. So when people actually do come, they're having some manifestation of some liver damage already, right? But the symptoms are actually that they complain about. You saw what she said. I don't know about you, Janae. I kind of feel like that today a little bit. Fatigue. You're tired, and it's described as exhaustion, a fatigue that is very hard to describe. And it's to varying degrees, of course, along the course of their disease, and also itchiness, pruritus, something that makes them so uncomfortable.
And we just heard about sleep. So if you've got bad pruritus, you can be so itchy that you don't actually sleep at night. And we've just heard how important sleep is.
But I just will say to you guys, how many people, raise your hand, have you ever had fatigue? Right? So, and what's really important here is the person, I noticed, said when they went to their GP, their primary care doctor, they hadn't heard of this before. So I would say not only are we here because of awareness, but if you're going in and seeing your healthcare provider, they have to, on the other end, recognize that what's going on to actually even think to actually diagnose. And a lot of the blood tests that you order, specifically a comprehensive metabolic panel, contains a blood test called alkaline phosphatase. And that test being abnormal is one of the first things to clue you in that you should be working up this person to see if they have PBC.
But we also need to take into account, if you look at people going to go and see their primary healthcare professional, about 10 to 20% of the time, they're going because they're suffering from fatigue. And fatigue can be for multiple different reasons why people are tired. I'm generally fatigued because I take my thyroid hormone with coffee, which is a no-no, which is a bad thing to do, bad doctor, bad patient. But at the end of the day, it's the second most common reason, or first or second most common reason why somebody actually goes to their primary care physician is actually fatigue. And it can be for multiple reasons. They can have anemia, they can have thyroid disease with a low thyroid, or they could have PBC. And women are notoriously bad, and this is a condition where you've got 90% of the individuals who are impacted are women. And women are notoriously bad for looking after other people. We know it's often the woman that's taking the significant other to the doctor rather than taking themselves to the doctor to care for themselves. And they're busy and they're doing a lot of things, and they don't necessarily look after themselves. So it's the real big reason to go out and educate people. Not because we want everyone to be so nervous to go out and every time they feel tired, I've got PBC, because we both went through medical school, so we've had lots of diseases that we think we've had as we've learned about them, but about really making people aware and also educating the healthcare professionals out there to take notice, and particularly if they're seeing some abnormalities coming through on liver results, that they actually take action and they start looking for something that's a rare disease, something that's impacting, 130,000 individuals in the US. So it doesn't sound like a big number, but it is a significant, because if you that one individual that it impacts, because everyone gives stats, like you've got a 13% chance as a woman to have breast cancer in the US, for example. But if you that one person, that statistic is meaningless. So it's really important that we do pick up these individuals to give them the care, because if we care for them, it makes a difference.
So I really love having this platform. By the way, Janae, did I tell you that I used to work in this neighborhood?
You did.
So I used to work right a few blocks away, and this is actually where I lived and took care of people who lived and worked in this community. And I think that that's what I want to, when you're really passionate about taking care of people and really caring, you really got the person in front of you and listen, right? So we deserve to have, patients deserve to have their primary care doctors really know them and hear what they're saying, and then to be able to say what's going on, and then to take it seriously, and then to be able to order exams and connect them to this. Because there are treatments available, and there are treatments that are available if the first regimen doesn't work. So what we could be doing is getting, and I heard a common theme, which is let's get to people not when they're at an end stage, let's get them earlier, and let's get people diagnosed so that they can be on the right treatment for them as soon as possible.
And we know if we treat these individuals that they have a life expectancy similar to the general population, which in the US, we heard earlier, is a little bit lower considering how much we spend on healthcare. But if you don't treat them, or if they don't respond well to treatment, then you're looking at a life expectancy of about 10 to 15 years. So really getting people diagnosed, and these women diagnosed predominantly, and the 10% of men that it impacts, becomes fundamentally important and significantly life-changing for people. So I hope you've learned a little bit about primary biliary cholangitis today, and thank you.
Check your alphos level. Okay. Thank you.
Here to discuss breakthroughs in women's healthcare, please welcome Lisa Mosconi, Director of the Weill Cornell Medicine Women's Brain Initiative and Program Director at Wellcome Leap. Nisha Parikh, Systems Director of the Women's Heart Program at Northwell Health. And Shari Goldfarb, Program Director of the Young Women with Breast Cancer Program at Memorial Sloane Kettering Cancer Center. With Yasmin Tayag, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Welcome and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. We've got a lot to talk about, so we're going to jump right in. We all know that there are real biological sex differences, and we need to understand them in order to heal disease. So we're going to start with the heart. For many years, I think most people can agree with this, we've thought of heart disease as a man's disease. But the truth is, and this was very surprising for me, it's the leading cause of death for women. And it's so often misdiagnosed. So Nisha, why is this happening? I'm kind of scared.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that even most women perceive that their leading cause of death will be breast cancer, when it's really true that the top 4 causes of cancer combined still don't account for the number of deaths that heart disease and stroke do on an annual basis in the United States and increasingly worldwide. But to your point and your question, I think there's a couple different reasons. I think, number one, we have a lot of biases as patients and providers, and we still sort of perceive that a person having a heart attack is a man. So kind of classically, middle-aged man clutching his chest, after shoveling snow. That was sort of our textbook definition of a heart attack. And those types of biases are hard to get rid of. So I think part of what I feel passionate about is educating patients and then even educating my fellow providers about this issue.
And so, I want to hear more about what are you educating patients and providers about? Are there symptoms that we're ignoring or that are being missed? What should we be taking seriously?
Well, one is that when a woman presents to the emergency department with symptoms of chest pain, really first, second, and third in our differential should be a heart attack. But oftentimes, when we have that patient in front of us, we'll say, oh, maybe she's having GERD, or maybe it's something else. So first and foremost, it's just to recognize that the most common symptom for a heart attack in women is the exact same as it is in men. It's just that we're seeing her differently. So that's the first piece of education. And then the second is really to let women know that this is your number one risk. And if you're having something that seems out of place, that's new, classically, that symptom of chest pressure or chest pain with exertion, so it's worse when you're exercising or you're under stress, then take that seriously and go straight to the emergency room and get that checked out.
And in terms of educating patients, what do they need to know about how their risk changes as they get older?
So age is the number one risk factor for heart disease for everyone. It's not something we can always turn back, but there are many things you can do to prevent heart disease. And so knowing your numbers is really important. What's your blood pressure? What's your cholesterol? What's your glucose, fasting glucose in your hemoglobin A1C? How much sleep are you getting? Exercise are you getting, et cetera? So the first step is really empowering yourself with that knowledge and then working with your doctor or your healthcare provider to try to optimize those risk factors to prevent heart disease in the first place. And I think for women, there are a couple time periods that are important in her life course that can kind of reveal these risk factors. And one important period is pregnancy. So pregnancy we think of as a cardiovascular stress test and a cardiometabolic stress test. So if a woman undergoes a normal pregnancy, that's a pretty good indicator that her heart disease risk will be pushed off several years. Whereas if a woman has preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure in pregnancy, gestational diabetes, has a preterm delivery, delivers a small baby, or has multiple pregnancy losses, she's at an excess risk for developing cardiovascular disease. And so that's an opportunity to take those risk factors more seriously and prevent them earlier.
Thank you, Nisha. I want to switch gears to talk about breast cancer. So the incidence of breast cancer in young women is rising, and it's pretty alarming. Shari, what's going on here?
So the incidence of breast cancer in young women is rising, and it's likely multifactorial in nature. So part of it's genetics, part of it's environment, and part of it we don't know. So we know that exposure to hormones, so when women get menses at a younger age, which we are now seeing in well-developed, well-nourished countries like the United States, so when the average age of initial menses was 14, now it's closer to 10, 11. So since women are getting their periods earlier and are delaying pregnancy until their 30s and 40s, there is more unstopped or uninterrupted menses. And this increases sort of hormone exposure to women, and we think that that is one risk factor. So we know having kids before the age of 30 is preventative for breast cancer. We know that drinking less alcohol and having a less sedentary lifestyle are also risk factors that we can intervene. But there are some uncontrollable risk factors, such as having a genetic mutation. So women who have BRCA1, BRCA2, PALB2, or a whole slew of mutations that we now know are going to be at higher risk. But what we do know is that these women can be screened more closely and intervened on at a younger age to help prevent breast cancer or detect it at an earlier time.
What should young women who are hearing this information, like learning about this trend, do first? What should they be doing about it?
It's important to know your family history. And there's many different risk calculators that you could do online or with your primary care doctor or your gynecologist to know what your actual risk of breast cancer is. If you have a strong family history, even without a genetic mutation, but the risk of getting breast cancer is 20% or higher, you qualify to get better screening or additional screening, where you could do MRIs alternating with mammograms every 6 months. And you can also be screened at a high-risk clinic. So MSKCC, where I work, has the RISE program, and many of the hospitals around the city have high-risk programs.
And I want to talk about the ways in which breast cancer treatment is changing, in particular to how it's also taking into account the quality of life. People have, there are side effects from the treatments, but tell me how you're thinking about addressing those.
So the great news is that the cure rate of breast cancer is also improving. So we're detecting cancers at a smaller size with better imaging, and we have better treatments. And we're trying not to overtreat patients. So we're really through looking at genomics, trying to give less chemotherapy, which improves quality of life. So people with smaller tumors, lymph node negative tumors, tumors that have maybe only 1 or 2 nodes involved, we actually test the tumor to look at risk of recurrence and benefit from chemo. So we can do really targeted therapy for patients and avoid chemotherapy, which has a lot of side effects when not necessary, but administer it for people who are going to gain the most benefit from it. In terms of symptoms, we really do pay attention now to quality of life, both during treatment and in survivorship, because we know our patients are fortunately going to live a long time, be cured of their cancer, and we don't want them to have long-standing side effects. So we have many programs in place now where we control nausea, neuropathy, fatigue, both as they're going through treatment, and then have a big focus on these side effects and symptoms during survivorship. We have programs looking at fertility, sexual health, and sort of better sleep habits to treat menopausal symptoms also.
Perfect, thank you, Shari. And Lisa, I want to talk to you about menopause. I think most people, when they think of menopause, they think hot flashes, insomnia, brain fog. And I think at best, people have an understanding of shifting hormones being the cause. But your work has shown that it's much more complicated. There's actually a big role for the brain to play in menopause. So can you talk to us about how they're linked?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I'm a brain scientist. I specialize not only in neuroscience, but also in radiology. I have a background in nuclear medicine, molecular imaging, which means that I do a lot of brain scans. And I do specialize in women's brain health, and specifically a woman's risk of Alzheimer's disease, which, as you probably know, is the most common form of dementia on the planet, affecting over 55 million individuals globally. What most people don't realize is that almost 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. And for a woman in her 60s, actually the risk of developing Alzheimer's is double the risk of developing breast cancer. And yet breast cancer is clearly recognized as a women's health issue, as it should be, but nobody really talks about the risk of Alzheimer's disease in women. So my team and I have been really focused on the earliest possible detection of Alzheimer's disease in women's brains, which has led us to study menopause as a possible turning point for Alzheimer's risk in women.
Yes. So
why menopause? Yes.
I would love to hear more about what's happening in the brain during menopause. That increases that risk.
Yes, so as a society, we associate menopause with the function of the ovaries, but in reality, menopause impacts the brain just as much as it does the ovaries. And the reason being that the hormones that we typically associate with reproductive function, like estrogen and progesterone, are brain hormones too. They're neuroprotective hormones that shield the brain from harm.
I think we have a slide up to illustrate this.
We do. So we were quite busy, my team and I. So we were really trying to understand the effects of menopause in the brain. And one thing that was completely missing is a tool that allowed us to measure the action of estrogen in the brain. So in 2024, we published the first ever brain estrogen imaging study of healthy women in midlife. And if you think about it, 2024, right? Women have been going through menopause for thousands of years, but here we are. And what we found is exactly the opposite of what we thought we would find, which is this. The way that estrogen works is like a key that needs to open a lock. The estrogen is the key, and the hormone receptor, or the estrogen receptor, is the lock. What's most important is the binding, is how they connect to each other. And the theories in neuroscience and preclinical science is that estrogen receptors would just simply fade from the brain a few years after the final menstrual period. What we found is exactly the opposite, and these brain scans show 3 women. One is premenopausal, the one in the middle is perimenopausal, irregular menstrual cycles, and the one to the right is postmenopausal, no menstrual cycles for at least 12 months. If you look at the middle of the brain, there's one bright red dot. That's the pituitary gland. That is the part of the brain that tells the ovaries, I need estrogen, I need it now. And the idea was that we wouldn't find any signal after menopause because there shouldn't be any receptors, according to preclinical science. What we found is the opposite, is that the density of the estrogen receptors is actually increased after the final menstrual period, which is a way, at least we think, it may be the brain saying, I really want this estrogen still. So we're looking into that now. And the increase was also associated with brain fog, which you mentioned, and presence of depressive symptoms. So we are thinking this is a brain, to your point, under stress. We think of menopause as a stress test for brain health and future neurological risk.
I know you have exciting cutting-edge solutions, but we'll get to that in a moment. And so, I want to talk about some of the breakthroughs, the game changers that have gotten people excited about women's health. Nisha, I know that we have not traditionally had great screening tools for heart disease in young women, but that's changing because we're repurposing something.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sits at the intersection of our fields. But we're repurposing an old test, which is the mammogram, to now screen heart disease. So at Northwell, we've started universally reading something called breast arterial calcification. The acronym is BAC, BAC. And with that, we're able to tell if a woman has atherosclerosis in her breast arteries. We're finding that over the 100,000 mammograms we read this past year, 13% of scans were positive for BAC. And in some cases, this has led patients to seek out preventive care from a cardiologist and even found that they have heart disease and have needed a stent or a bypass surgery. So I think this is a really exciting area. It's the ability to detect breast cancer and heart disease in the same test, and I think those are both incredibly important issues for women, as well as brain health.
Absolutely. Shari, there have been many ways to be proposed to help treat brain cancer, but one of the ones I found most interesting is gene editing. How does that work?
So we know in our young breast cancer patients, many of them have not yet finished their family planning or have not had kids at all. So because we know that most of these women are going to be cured of their cancer and go on and live long, healthy lives, we refer many of our patients to see reproductive endocrinologists for fertility preservation. And we now send all of our patients who have gene mutations or genetic mutations to get fertility preservation. Because even if they don't have infertility, you can now do pre-implantation genetic testing, which means that the geneticists can test the embryos for gene mutations, and then the family can choose to only implant healthy embryos, which now can get rid of diseases such as BRCA mutations, BRCA1, BRCA2, but also cystic fibrosis, glucose storage disorders, muscular dystrophy. So this is sort of really changing how you can prevent genes from being passed on to future generations. And now, moreover, they're starting to do studies looking at gene therapy, which would actually be in vitro gene therapy, which is just being studied now, but hopefully in the upcoming years will actually be in practice, where when a woman gets pregnant, if the embryo is found to have a mutation, they can actually change the gene in the mutation to prevent the child from being, when they're born, from having that disease or developing that disease. So it's a really exciting field, and it really intersects with breast cancer because many of our young patients are referred to get fertility preservation prior to having and starting their treatment because the cancer chemotherapies cause infertility. And if patients want to have children that are biologically their own, this is a way that we can assure they can.
And Lisa, breakthrough in your field, you're researching hormones as a way to reduce the risk in Alzheimer's in women.
Yes.
I think we have a slide for this too. Can you talk to us about how that works?
Yes. We are looking into using hormone therapy to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease in women based on the notion that estrogen, in particular, is a neuroprotective hormone that seems to shield the brain from harm. Now, the field of hormone replacement therapy, which is now called menopause hormone therapy, has been conflicted, to put it mildly, right? And the knowledge that we have in Alzheimer's disease prevention especially is very, very limited. So yes, we are looking at whether initiating menopause hormone therapy very close to the timing of menopause is able to feed those neurons that looked under stress and potentially protect women's brains against future Alzheimer's disease and dementia. What do we need in order to achieve that? We need money. We need people, we need scientists, we need data, we need research. So, where's my slide? It's there. So I am excited. Here we go. I am delighted to announce that we have just launched a $50 million program of research, which is dedicated exclusively to women's brain health, menopause, and Alzheimer's disease. This program is sponsored by Wellcome Leap, which is an independent subsidiary of the Wellcome Trust. I am the program director for this program of research, which is called CARE, Cutting Alzheimer's Risk Through Endocrinology. And we are blessed to be a network of 64 leading scientists from all over the world. We're looking at over 100 data sets from over 6 continents and over 20 million clinical data points on women from all over the world. So CARE is effectively the largest global examination of women's risk of Alzheimer's disease ever attempted. And I think you can see here the maps of where all the data is coming from, which is really global. And we are just thrilled to be able to do this.
That's incredible.
Thank you.
And so, all of these incredible advances, all of the attention that's being paid to women's health after years of neglect, it's really exciting, but how do we make sure that it reaches women? One of the issues that comes up a lot in my work as a health journalist is that women, especially young women, are quite vulnerable to health misinformation.
Yeah.
There is a lot of social media influencers that are peddling nonsense, but young women are, kind of falling for it. And a lot of that seems to come down to like a lack of trust in the healthcare they've been given. How do you think about, meeting that population and like reaching them at a time when they're especially distracted by all this other noise? I'll throw it to Shari.
So one thing that we started is the Young Women with Breast Cancer program, and this is really geared for women who are 45 and younger, diagnosed with breast cancer, who are at a unique time in their lives where they're taking care of little kids, and they're also taking care of sick parents, and they have a lot on their plate, and maybe not always getting the best information and education. So we started this program really to educate women, both patients that we see, but also more broadly, with webinars geared for young women, networking sessions for young women, and ways where we can incorporate care for them. So our program includes social workers, fertility counselors, people who help with career trajectories, and a way to also get knowledge out. So we do webinars in person, online, to educate women to be proactive, to advocate for themselves. If someone tells them, don't worry about that because that mass doesn't appear to be anything worrisome, and you're worried and it's different, go get a second opinion. Really, you are always your own best advocate, and we tell this to patients all the time in the community and at our own hospital.
Shari, you touched on a point that has come up in my own reporting, women feeling like they're not heard by their physicians. They're told that pain they're feeling is normal. What other steps are we taking to address that loss of trust in that relationship? Would either of you like to jump in?
Sure. One additional struggle with heart disease in women is that there are some types of heart attacks and some types of chest pain that are due to heart disease that not just present differently, but they're actual different disease entities. So it's true that women are more likely to experience spasm of the coronary arteries that could lead to angina or a heart attack, or they're more likely to experience microvascular dysfunction, which is disease of the small tributaries of the larger heart arteries that still supply blood and oxygen to the heart, and that can still cause really debilitating chest pain. A patient who has one of these conditions can show up to the ER literally year after year, and when we go in with stress testing and an angiogram, we might not see anything. And so essentially, if we're unable to diagnose this, we can't help them. So that's another really important point, is that there are tests to diagnose these, but they haven't had the uptake that they need. And so that's something else that I feel passionate about and am working on, along with many other colleagues. So getting patients the correct diagnosis to really acknowledge what they're going through.
I also wonder whether there needs to be a change in the way we communicate between providers and patients. We've talked about backstage social media being a potential channel for that, but it's tricky. How do you think about reaching younger women, especially?
On social media?
Oh, just in general.
I think really research and education. I think especially in the field of brain health, women's concerns around the health of their brains and their mental health are constantly just dismissed. And it's like you're either under stress, you're just a woman, you're getting older, or you're making it up, it's all in your head, right? That needs to change. And I think it changes with research. We do need to do a better job of addressing women's concerns. I often say that the research we do with brain scans and with biological markers, with that kind of clinical data that people can grasp easily and can be easily communicated to physicians and to scientists and patients alike, the vast majority of what we do is really validate what women have been saying for hundreds of years. And I think it's terrible that we do need to validate what a woman is reporting, however we do in this society. So it does start with the research and then a change in professional guidelines and the change in medical guidelines and the change in how we communicate with individuals. I think that in my field, menopause is now having a little bit of a moment. It's a hot topic. There is a lot of misinformation, but there's also a lot of good information. So I think it's important to appreciate what it means to be a trusted source of information and what your credentials are and what your education is, and have you ever actually seen a patient, and are you liable for the patient's outcomes? No one on social media is liable for anybody's outcomes. So it's there where you want to get your best information? Probably not. You may get inspiration, right? Everybody's opinions are very, very welcome. But then there's actual data. There's actual information. There are people who have been practicing medicine for many, many years and do take care of their patients and take responsibility, which is an important distinction, I think.
Thank you. We're going to have to end it there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here.